Hey, so hello everyone. My name is Raphael with Kinokuniya, and today we have the great pleasure of speaking with Sensei Koshin Paley Ellison. Koshin is an accomplished author, Zen teacher, Jungian psychotherapist, and ACP certified chaplaincy educator. With over a decade of experience as a chaplain and psychotherapist, Koshin co-founded the Zen Center for Contemplative Care, a nonprofit organization that provides contemplative approaches to care through education, care parenting, and Zen practice. The center's methodologies have been widely recognized and have positively impacted the lives of countless individuals, which is a very impressive resume you have. So with that, Koshin, how are you today? Oh, you lost me. Give me 1 second. I'm back. How are you today?
I am wonderful. I'm very happy to see you.
So to start, and I'm sure this is a question you get all the time, how did you become a Zen Buddhist monk? What was your journey like that brought you to there?
Well, there's many ways to respond to that question. And one is I became a Zen Buddhist monk because of 88 generations of teachers have dedicated their lives to practice and to be a benefit to others. So I often feel very grateful and lots of gratitude. So part of the reason we get to practice now is because of so many before us. And so that's one of the reasons. And another reason is that my family came from Eastern Europe and were kind of the crazy ones in the family who felt that things were dangerous and that they should leave. And so they were kind of oddballs in their families and left because they thought it was getting dangerous. And the remaining parts of my family who didn't leave actually were all killed in the Holocaust, died in the Holocaust. And so sometimes I think about I became a Zen Buddhist monk because of the epigenetic trauma that people talk about, but I also think about that I became a Zen Buddhist monk because of the epigenetic courage of learning to bear what's unbearable, learning to become intimate with what is really happening. And so as a young boy, I used to go to my grandfather's house and he would save these National Geographics for me. And we would look at them on his white shag carpet and lay down. And I loved him so much. And so time with him was really awesome. I would just flip through the magazine, and I still can remember that smell when we used to look at magazines. And there was in National Geographic, they used to have lost native tribes. And in this particular one, they had a profile of a city, and it was of Tokyo. And there was this image of all these different images of the city. And then I remember turning the page and there was this photograph of this man with the Arya Ragasa hat, which is this large bamboo hat where you can't see the person's eyes. And he was doing what's called tokuhatsu, which is, begging, which is actually a way of remembering gratitude for the generations that we're interdependent, that we need each other. Like you and I, Raphael, we couldn't have this conversation without each other. And it's all of these ways that we use in the tradition to remember that. And he had this little smile, and all the people in the photograph are blurred. And except him, he was in focus. And I remember feeling this deep draw to this image of this man, of another way of being. And I remember reading the caption underneath. It said Zen Buddhist monk in Tokyo. And I want to be that. And I remember coming home from that trip and telling my mother I wanted to grow up to be a Zen Buddhist monk. And she was like, that's cool. But there was really something to that stillness in the midst of things that really continues to inspire me to really have a strong and deep base that is flexible and engaged in the world. Continues to inspire me. So as a boy at 8 years old, that was a kind of a crystalline moment of something crystallizing. And it was not until later that I met my first Zen teacher.
Well, you definitely became a Zen Buddhist monk, so.
I did. Yeah, isn't that crazy? Like some people say, I want to be an astronaut, and they don't become one. And my aspiration was to be a Zen Buddhist monk, and here I am, a Zen Buddhist monk.
Hearing you mention that story, it reminds me of, in your book, Untangled, you talk about sitting with your pain. And, for me, hearing that triggers almost like a counterintuitive notion, because you think of pain, the first thing you want to do is alleviate it, get away. Can you dive more into that? Like, what does it mean to sit with your pain and why that's beneficial?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things, so this was the kind of the leap from that moment of when I was 8 years old, and also growing up in a house where there was a lot of violence and a lot of chaos, and where I felt pretty sure that life didn't necessarily mean it continues. So I felt endangered. And I also really felt that these were really good people, and they are, but doing or allowing very painful things to happen. So this big gap between what someone's values are and what they're actually doing in their life, right? And it was through these, I think, a series of 2 movies that I kind of got to this point about the pain, which was, and I write about this in the book, it's just about that I started to understand you could have a teacher from these 2 movies, where one of them was Star Wars, like the first one, before there was, TV series and before Baby Yoda. And, but it was this magical understanding, you could have a teacher in the world who actually cares about who you are and wants to see you develop as a human being. That was amazing. Amazing. Blew me away. And yet it felt really hard to imagine how to become a Jedi, from a suburban life. I couldn't quite. How do I get to Tatooine? I don't know how to get there. And so I felt a little abstract. And yet the idea was very clear. And then there was another kind of fun movie, and this is all in the 80s, and the 1980s, not the 1880s, but not that old yet. And Karate Kid, with Ralph Macchio, and it was again this whiny character who learns from a teacher, and I was like, oh, karate, that feels, you could get a karate teacher. And I realized, at the local strip mall there's a karate school. That felt closer than Tatooine, And so I remember walking there, and it was in the basement of the drugstore, this dingy, kind of pretty gross situation. It really smelled bad, mildewy and sweat. What a combination. And yet it felt like this incredible place. And the teacher was named Sensei White. And Sensei White was very disciplined. And there was not a lot of kids there. And, but he used to have us sit on the wood floor in Seiza, which is where you have your legs underneath yourself. And now we have like cushions and all of this, very nice situation. There was like on the wood floor, and really painful. I remember sweating and sweating and sweating. And he used to walk very slowly and deliberately around us and saying, "You'll never be free until you're still with your pain." And that teaching continues to be a gateway for me. And it's really like this gate to go through, like, oh, right. And I felt like as an 11-year-old kid, like I was learning a superpower like that. And I remember thinking, like, this is superhero shit, man. Like, I remember feeling like, wow, this is incredible. And it also was the beginning of compassion for me, of really understanding, oh my goodness. I remember even thinking like, oh, the people in my house and the bullies in my school, they didn't know how to sit with their pain. So I think it is counterintuitive, right? So if we think about our evolutionary relatives, the little like 2 or 3 celled hydras, those little things in biology class, they also move away from what's uncomfortable. So as beings, we move away from what's uncomfortable. And what to me was so amazing is that I started to understand the opportunity of being human, because we can say, oh yeah, I want to move away because it's uncomfortable, and I can still move towards it. That we can actually work with our mind in a different way. And there's actually freedom is available. Mm-hmm. And it's not an abstract thing. Mm-hmm. And I started to actually have real experiences of freedom. And it was through sitting with my pain for the first time, I think, in my life.
Yeah, wow. It reminded me of a quote from the late Thich Nhat Hanh when it said, like, I'm gonna paraphrase it, if someone causes you harm, it's because they're hurting inside and it's spilling, like it's overspilling. So kind of to sit with it kind of keeps it, almost can see what's happening for itself and it doesn't express outward. Very interesting. Your book, I was fascinated by this when I came upon it. It kind of starts off with that kind of almost like a koan. Says, the inner tangle and the outer tangle. This generation is entangled in a tangle. So I ask of Gautama this question: who succeeds in disentangling this tangle? And it got me thinking, in our current culture, like stress and anxiety and a whole host of all these emotions are just rampant. So how do you see, Buddhism and Zen Buddhism in general, kind of fitting into the wider conversation that we're having now in terms of mental health awareness?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. One of them that comes to mind is that, my goodness, one of the things that I remember the first time I heard that teaching, which I was 17 at a retreat with James Hillman and Jack Kornfield and Robert Bly and Michael Mead. And it was like this men's retreat. And I remember Jack Kornfield saying that teaching. And I remember thinking, my goodness, that means it's up to us. And there was something amazing that happened to me in that moment too, which was, and people have been struggling with this for at least like more than 2,500 years. So this is not a contemporary situation, but a human experience that we get entangled. We get, we have illness. Like as you were talking about, we have mental illness, We have physical illness, we have spiritual illness. That illness is part of our life, and how we are with it is truly what we have to work with. You know, I very often think about the great Toni Morrison, a wonderful writer and human. And she said, you know, why is too difficult? We have to take refuge in how. So I always think about, how can I be with this situation? How do I be with my entanglements?
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the habit can be getting more entangled, because we are so into the aversion of like, I don't want this. And I think it's very similar to experience that many people have when they have a serious diagnosis of some kind. Often the question is, why me? I remember when I received a diagnosis of cancer, I thought, my turn. And how will I be with this? And so I think that we, as a collective culture, how do we begin to just appreciate how entangled we become? And how do we do something fresh and new? What is the opportunity to meet our life in a fresh way? Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's very popular to feel victimized by illness, whether it's mental illness or physical illness, or by our lives, by the different, you know, lately everyone calls it trauma. The Buddha called it suffering, you know, and pain. And somehow, like, how we deal with our suffering and our pain is very important. And making sure, at least in my own experience, really reaching out for the help that I need. Mm-hmm. Finding a wonderful, related, connected therapist. You know, finding a really great Zen teacher, you know, finding that kind of, who are the guides that can really become pillars in our life, so that we can really stake down our life, so that we're not just wandering through. Nothing wrong with wandering, but I think that it comes to a point, in particular around freedom from our entanglements. As I experienced for many years, I was sort of like a lone wolf and over-identified as a lone wolf. And I was like, I'm just doing my thing. Or like the really common expression these days is people saying, you do you and I'll do me, you know, like, which, you know, is somehow sad, because we're forgetting how we're connected and how we need each other when we say that, even though it's often said in a joking manner. Mm-hmm. But I think that, you know, for many years, I really identified as this lone wolf, as this kind of heroic attitude. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm a lone wolf, I'm all alone. And I remember being on this, I've written about this also in my other book, Wholehearted, and about how, you know, I was on this Greyhound bus, you know, going out to another retreat with a different teacher, and I had my beads on, and I remember the woman next to me was like, "Oh, are you a Buddhist?" And I remember thinking like, "Oh, she saw my beads," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm a spiritual person." And I remember saying, "Yes," you know, feeling so pleased. Mm-hmm. And she's like, "Oh, great. So who's your teacher?" And I was listing all these different teachers I've been studying with, and here and there. And it's a wonderful thing, actually. And she said, "Oh, so you're a lone wolf." And I remember thinking, yes, yes, she recognizes that too, you know, and which is the kind of the great, you know, Western white mythology of like the John Wayne person, right? And she said, oh, so you know, the interesting thing about lone wolves is unless they're scouting, they're sick. And I remember thinking, oh shit. Like I had like really taken on this identity of a victim and kind of, and which actually was my wound, right? Because the reality was that I was the victim of violence, of sexual violence, of physical violence, and anti-Semitic violence. Those actually did happen. They were just true. But I also had, on top of that, had added this like protective layer, like an armor of my victimhood, which is different than, you know, I'm not talking about that we should be denying these things, but there was like this extra layer, and I was walking around in this big armor. And what it had become was a cage, because it's like the, you know, the story of the Japanese soldier who was found on a little island in the Pacific, like, I don't know, like 15 years after World War II ended. And he ran out with his gun, and like, because someone came, and he didn't know the war was over. And it had been over a long time. So I often feel such tenderness towards that man on that island, because I think that that's just how we are sometimes. We forget that that's not happening now. And so that armor had become a cage, because there was nothing for it to armor me against anymore. It had served me well for the time that it did. And so that had become a cage, and the front of the cage was sort of the things that I knew. And the sides of the cage were the things I kind of knew. And the back of the cage was, I didn't know what was there, because I couldn't see it. And so I think in so many ways, like, how do we learn how to do something fresh? How do we do something new? And to me, that's why having relationships with nourishing others, teachers and therapists and good friends, you know, is so important, because they can reflect to us what's behind us a little bit, or they can reflect for us how we're doing and how we're experiencing and how they're experiencing us.
Yeah. You know, listening to this, I'm thinking of what you're saying about the lone wolf, and how it seems like that armor in that cage comes in because, yeah, a lot of people have been hurt or betrayed, or just regular relationship issues. So going into new situations with other people can be very scary, and you feel very vulnerable. So that cage is there protective. But what advice would you have for someone who wants to start almost taking off the cage, but they don't even know where the locks are anymore? They don't even know how to begin to take it off, but they want to. What would you say is a good technique to start taking off the layers bit by bit?
You know, it's kind of like the meditation instruction that I like, you know, just like feeling the ground. Like, are you actually on the ground? You know, whether if you're sitting in a chair, just feeling your sit bones in the chair. Like, can you, and learning how to trust that. And then maybe even learning how to rock side to side and knowing that you're rocking side to side. And then finding your breath in your lower belly, below your belly button, just below your belly button. And learning how to experience your body. It's like, oh, I'm here. I'm here. I know for myself, like, I was not aware of where I was a lot of the time. So like literally like bringing myself into the ground
Mm-hmm.
in a very kind of ordinary way. Like, can I feel like right now, like the zabuton, which is a large cushion that I'm sitting on right now. I'm holding it. I'm feeling my sit bones, feeling my breath in my lower belly. For me, is a really great place to begin. Like super basic and super advanced all at the same time. Because in many ways, it's like the foundational thing. And then see if you can actually just open your shoulders a millimeter, you know?
Mm.
And so like, oh, okay. And I'm here. And I'm here. And so practicing bringing ourselves back to being here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know if you can hear, but there's a siren outside,
Mm-hmm.
which means, oh, my goodness, how fortunate we are to live in a city where there are ambulances. Someone is responding to a cry for help.
Mm-hmm.
We recently were in a little tiny town in Mexico. Amazing place. And there was a fire, and everyone just watched the place burn down because there's no fire help, no fire truck, no pails, no extinguishers. So in the same way, it's like, but it was beautiful in a strange way to see the people just watching the fire. They're like, well, this is what we can do. So in a way, it's like the same thing. It's like ground yourself in what is real as much as possible. Like, wow, we're going to watch this fire. And then when it's done, we can all participate in rebuilding.
Wow.
But it's very difficult to do that if we're not in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that to be in our body is how we can begin to connect to the world. And I think, at least in my own experience of experiencing victimization and challenges of that, then you kind of, my experience is that you feel you're not part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so learning how do you practice belonging on this kind of super foundational way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I know you're someone that does a lot of work with people at the last moments of their lives. I was very curious, how has that not only affected your practice, but also just your personal perspective on life and what's actually important?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I spend some of my time with people who know that they're dying, and all of my time with people who don't know that they're dying. And maybe I learned similar things from both.
Mm.
That it's very easy to preoccupy with what isn't.
Mm.
I've spent many times with people who knew that they're dying, but were living in regret. You know, it's like we have this opportunity right now to hear these more sirens.
Mm-hmm.
And we could live in an experience right now like, oh, I wanted to listen to this or have this conversation without sirens. Listen. And in many ways, these sirens are such wonderful teachers of how we wish things would be.
Mm.
Like, I'm so grateful There they go. Off they go. And I think that it's just when people are dying, that the opportunity is to actually experience what you're experiencing while you're experiencing. And a few people do that I've experienced. But most of them are living in regret, much like how they lived, living in distraction. Some people watch TV until like the last moment of their life. And that's just the way it is. And yet the opportunity is to say like, wow, I'm alive. And the people that have inspired me are like the ones who are saying, my goodness, I have not paid attention for most of my life. And how can I pay attention at least now? And, you know, most of us just think we have an infinite time. But the one thing we have infinite time is, as far as we know, there's no clear reports back, is that we'll be dead for like most of time. We're going to be dead for like a lot longer than we're alive, as far as I know. And so to me, what I keep learning is like, this is it. My goodness, what I do with this life is happening right now. Like you and I, and those who are listening, like, my goodness, can I really pay attention right now to this experience? Like this light flooding in behind me. It's like amazing, amazing. And it's so nice to like even know, like, I know where you are. Like you and I were sitting there together,
Yes,
not so long ago, you know, and there's something about that. It's like, oh, I can imagine you.
mm-hmm.
And now the radiator.
Uh-huh.
Amazing. And we can spend most of our life like wishing it was different. I wish I was silent. I wish I had more friends. I wish I was more successful. I wish that I lived in Hawaii. I think about this couple that I met years ago. And he had an aneurysm that burst in his brain. And he was walking to his retirement party. Mm-hmm. He had just gotten out of his car, and he and his wife, who loved each other so much, were walking to his retirement party, literally, like just got out of the car. And this was going to be the beginning of their life together. They were going to go on cruises and go around the world, like all the things that they've been saving and waiting for their whole life. And he was airlifted to a hospital I was working in, and they were so beautiful. He was bleeding out, so there was really not anything that they could do medically for him. And they were holding each other, and he was dying. And they were talking about like how it was so amazing because they were just embarrassed. And I actually write about this too, but like they were not ashamed of what they had done, like waited their whole lives to live. They said, but we're so embarrassed that we waited our whole lives to live. And I just found that so helpful. It is embarrassing. We do so many embarrassing things, and it's so healthy just to like, what in the world was I doing? Mm-hmm. I was not living according to my values. what I said I really cared about was not what I was doing. So to me, what I keep learning is about how do you stay fresh? How can you be more connected to what is really alive and precious?
Sometimes for me personally, I try to always keep, the fact of not only the inevitability of death, but don't know when it's going to happen in the forefront. And sometimes that's can really bring me to the moment and make everything seem, okay, we're here, everything is precious. Other times they can fill with more like existential anxiety. So whenever you can speak on that, because I've had a conversation with a friend about a similar topic, and when she would think about it, it just brought anxiety and dread as opposed to any type of peace. And like she just wanted to avoid the conversation or even the thought of it, to the point where even driving by a graveyard gave her intense anxiety. So how do you deal with people who, or advice to people who are just very afraid of even holding that concept before them?
Well, I don't know, but what I'm curious about is, what are you really afraid of? To me, I've been with lots of people who are dying or very sick, and they're like, I'm afraid. And so to me, the question is, well, what are you afraid of?
Mm-hmm.
And they might say, well, I might lose control. I said, that's definitely going to happen. So what are you afraid of? And so to begin to get curious about what's underneath the fear. Many people are afraid of losing control. Many people are afraid of pain. When lack of control and pain are guaranteed. I don't know anyone who gets through a life without that. And what a weird goal, to try to get through life avoiding pain, discomfort, illness, aging, and death. I mean, it's not going to happen. And I think what's so striking for many of us is that many of us have those fears of those things that the historical Buddha was like, these are totally going to happen. It's so fascinating to me. It's so interesting. And how do we get involved in that space between things? I was thinking about that wonderful director, Miyazaki, and he has this character called No Face in his film Spirited Away. And it's interesting, most of his most famous characters don't speak, right? And the forest spirits and the little dust motes and Totoro, the most famous of his characters don't speak at all. And there's something to that. It's like, how do we learn how to be quiet? And also, when he talked about No Face, he said, he is an exemplar of there's a Japanese word called ma, which means the space between, which is where everything connects. That No Face is ma. That how do we allow space where nothing is happening, where of course everything is happening. And I think learning how to have a different kind of relationship, even for a moment at a time, a moment of just allowing the unknown. One of my favorite things to do is to you know, find places where you can see the night sky and just look at it. And I love, just like looking out. We go to this place every year where it's just the deep expanse. And it's a great place to practice. Like if you've got problems and fears, just tell that to the cosmos. I'm afraid I'm going to lose control. Like the cosmos is like, and wait for the response. I mean, it's so beautiful to like realize, like, or just like look up at the night sky and say, I've got problems, and hear the response. To allow that kind of very deep, spacious response. That even, the earth itself will not last. It's not even designed to last. Things come and go. We all come and go. I mean, it's also amazing that like for 3 billion years, there was these little bacteria on this planet. And like their little bodies, like their one-celled bodies were making oxygen for 1 billion years so that we can breathe. And like we think that we've got problems, right? And I think that it's just because we get so insular. And so one of the powerful teachings, I think, of death, of lack of control, is that it can actually begin to untangle our aloneness and to realize like, wow, beings have been dying for a long time. They've been born and dying for a long time, and I'm part of that. I'm part of this enormous long river of birth and death. And how do I open up to that so that we can be more part of the world? And to me, this is why like a Zen practice is so helpful, because it allows us to plant ourselves firmly here, in the midst of everything. But if we keep running or crunching, it's so hard to experience the miracle of a fire truck. The mystery of 3 billion years of bacteria making oxygen.
And now it's so much easier to not be here with all our social media and everything and all these different things pulling at us our attention. It's like it shocks even me. And I'm always on it, so I can imagine how it is. I want to ask, for someone who's watching and was curious, never done Zen practice, and is curious, how would you advise or recommend them to get started? What's a good first step entry point into beginning a Zen practice, or starting up or restarting up a Zen practice?
Well, we live in an amazing moment. The going through the pandemic of COVID-19, now, like you can receive Zen instruction from Australia, from anywhere, mostly free and online, and Zoom, and amazing. So find a group that is okay enough. No group is perfect. Everywhere is going to be a little funky because we're human beings. And to find a place where they're offering beginning instruction of some kind. And I know here we offer it every other Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern time. And so it's just a really wonderful opportunity to do it. You know, someone came the other day for beginning instruction. It was so great. And they were like, well, I've been reading about it for a couple of years and I watch a lot of YouTube videos. It was so beautiful, you know, and you realize like, oh, I think it's time to actually do it, you know. So I feel like it's not about trying it either. You know, most people stop meditation because they feel like they don't feel better. There was this like great study done in like the 90s, I think, about like why do people stop meditating? Because they didn't feel better. Well, meditation, especially Zen, Zazen, is not designed to make you feel better. It's designed so that you can enter the gate of ease and joy. But it's the joy that you can experience anything and be there. Not the joy of like, hey. It's the joy of like, wow, I can experience misery and happiness and sadness and rage and whatever it is, deep gratitude, and be here. It's so cool. And so like learning how to do that to me, so that takes time. So I always encourage people to kind of feel it around different places. And so again, this doesn't matter whether you live in a rural place or an urban place, because places are accessible on Zoom. But I think that it's really important to stick around somewhere for long enough, especially for when your preferences come up and you're like, I don't like this, I don't like that, and not listen to those so much. Unless you feel like something's terrible that's happening, then get out of there. But in general, most places are not going to be totally to your liking, and that's important. But do it anyway. You know, a friend of ours just sent us this scroll, this beautiful scroll, and it says, "No words, only action." So it's like, it doesn't matter what you say, but what are you actually doing? So if you want to practice meditation, practice meditation. Doesn't matter what you think about it and what you say about it. Just do it.
Makes no sense. Sometimes it's that simple. Actually.
Or as one of Choda's first teacher told him, just shut up.
I remember that story, yeah. That was great. That was funny. So part of the book that really made me like put it down and laugh for a second before actually it just came up to me and I want to ask, how has does your Zen practice informed your writing? And I technically, like, are you almost like, do you approach it as a form of practice or do you approach it as like something else?
Yeah, you know, in Zen, everything is a form of practice. You know, that's why I was so drawn to Zen, because the teaching is that there's walking practice and laying down practice and shaving practice, and everything is a practice. So yes, writing too, and really noticing your mind. And I found the practice gave me the practice of writing this only happened because I feel like I've been sitting for over 35 years, because I had to write about some very challenging things that were very painful. And I felt like actually an ethical obligation as a teacher to share my own experience of what's hard. Because I think it's easy to talk about it from a distance, but I want to companion people. So I think that my daily zazen and continuous practice over the years has really helped me to kind of ride the bronco and stay on the saddle
Mm.
as I was writing about very difficult things that felt like I was getting thrown around and thrashed around by in my mind. And I was able to kind of stay with it and stay with it and stay with it. And I really did feel enormous gratitude for the practice itself, so that I could be really with the writing and write through that experience and into that experience.
Mhm.
And again, actually, I often thought about those 88 generations of people just like who were with us, and just like, okay, they did it and I can do it. And, you know, it's pretty beautiful to remember, like, that's actually a way of showing our gratitude. By practicing is a way of saying, thank you, Shakyamuni Buddha. So I can practice thoroughly too.
That was beautiful. I guess to begin to wrap it up, I wanted to say this might be asking for oversimplification, but for your book, Untangled, to people who pick it up, what are you hoping they get out of it?
A mirror
Mm.
to see how that you can be companioned in what's challenging, and that there's a way to work with challenge with integrity and courage and love. And even when it's really, really dark, things are possible as long as we stay through. And we need others. And I feel like those things are the most important things.
Well, thank you very much, Koshin. That was a absolute beautiful discussion. So, Untangled, Walking the Eightfold Path to Clarity, Courage, and Compassion is available at Kinokuniya. Koshin was very generous to sign some copies. So if you order on the link that's going to be left in the description box below, you can get a signed copy from Koshin while the supplies last. Once again, Koshin, thank you so much for taking time out of your, I'm sure, busy schedule to be with us.
It's a joy to be with you, Raphael.
Thank you.